Question number 6, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. How much do independent schools currently receive per student on average under the current funding model, and how much would they receive per student if they received the cost to the Crown of fully funding a student in the state mainstream system?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give a somewhat longer answer than would be usual to be accurate for the House, if you would give me some latitude.
Order. The normal course of events, as the Minister's office would advise me before question time, I'll acknowledge it will be a slightly longer answer, but I expect 2 clear dollar figures to be given.
Okay.
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, current funding arrangements across the education system are complex and do not easily translate into what difference in learning outcomes occurred for individual students, whatever option of schooling has been chosen. That's why we're having a comprehensive funding review. We're in the middle of that consultation process. In responding to questions yesterday explaining the rationale for different proposals under consultation, I may have led others to believe that I was proposing that independent schools receive the same level of support as a student in the mainstream system. That was not my intention. As I stated in my answers, the proposal that independent school funding be linked to per student funding, which itself is a proposal, is simply a further proposal. The focus is the mechanism, not the amount. Independent schools currently receive a capped amount of funding per year. An average can vary from year to year depending on how many children there are at which year levels. Equally, in the mainstream system, depending on which schooling option and how many children there are at each level in which communities with what kind of property provision will drive an average at any given time. Averages for different purposes at different points in time could end up being very misleading. Independent schools receive $41.5 million per year, as well as the Aspire Scholarship Fund, which is $4.1 million per year. Total enrolments.
I have a point of order from the Right Honourable.
Mr. Speaker, if it is the Minister's intention to correct misinformation to the House yesterday, this is not the time to do it. She should have done it at the moment the House sat this morning.
Order. And the member's making a very valid point. It seems to me that the longer explanation certainly started. The longer answer was certainly earlier to an explanation trying to give some context and meaning to an answer given in the House yesterday. I'm still waiting for the answers to some dollar questions. If you can't give them, then advise the House and I'll deal with that matter afterwards. Bring the answer to a quick conclusion. It's been going on for long enough.
Mr. Speaker, I was explaining in the introduction why there isn't a reliable average, so I'm giving the totals. So, independent schools receive $41.5 million, as well as $4.1 million per year for Aspire scholarships. Total enrolments in 2015 were just under 26,900. Last year in primary and secondary schooling, we spent over $5.1 billion on more than 728,000 kids. It would be misleading the House to state that there is a useful or reliable average for all of the above reasons.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order. Chris Hipkins.
That was indeed a very long answer, and I listened very carefully to it. The question was quite specific. Now, it was asking for averages based on current student numbers. The Minister hasn't actually answered the question.
Order. No. I agree entirely with Mr Hipkins. There are some figures given, and if you have access to a calculator in the House, you'll be able to work it out for yourself. It is an answer that I think could have been given. I'm not going to ask the question to be repeated because we may find the answer will be repeated and we could be here for a very long time. The way forward is to grant the member 2 additional supplementary questions. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why did she tell the House yesterday that her proposal was to give private schools funding, quote, equivalent to how much the Crown would incur if those students were being fully funded in the state mainstream system?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Mr Speaker, and as Hansard will reveal in my further answers, I said I am not proposing, and I want to confirm to the House that these are proposals and available for discussion, that the education system fund all of the costs. I am simply saying that the equitable approach would be to fund more closely to what it would cost the system if those students were fully educated in the publicly funded system.
Supplementary question, Mr.
Supplementary
Speaker.
question, Chris Hipkins.
How much more closely to what students are funded in the public school system is she proposing to fund private schools?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Mr Speaker, that would be a matter that would be a consequence on deciding whether or not a per-student funding approach in the three components that are currently in the proposal actually are finalised.
Supplementary,
It's a
supplementary question, Mr.
Order.
Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, would funding private schools equivalent to the level that state schools are funded on a per-student basis result in private school kids' funding increasing from around $1,400 per student per year to nearly $7,000 per student per year, a total of around $150 million extra on a yearly basis?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Mr Speaker, no, because we have different entitlements, for instance, for funding for kids in Māori medium. We have different funding levels for kids in alternative education provision. We have different... No, averages don't work. Thank you. That's exactly what I have been explaining to the House. And so what I am saying is that we are doing a funding review precisely because it is so complex, precisely because we cannot have a line of sight to how much we're putting in and to the actual educational outcomes, and because they vary from year to year. So that is why we are in the middle of a review, and I welcome your submissions.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Why should private schools, who charge parents thousands of dollars per term and who currently make some of whom can currently make significant yearly profits, receive additional taxpayer funding when state schools are barely able to make ends meet?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member is making assertions for which there is no actual evidence at the moment. So we know that we're putting a lot of taxpayers' funding into vote education, but we are not getting the equivalent lift in achievement for all children and young people. And that's why we're going through a funding review now. We're interested in every New Zealand kid being educationally successful.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
If providing additional resources and linking resourcing to students who aren't achieving is the government's objective, how does increasing funding to students who attend private schools, who already do better on average than students attending state schools, contribute to that objective?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Because that's not the objective. The objective is that we consider a per-student funding approach that begins from how much does it cost to deliver a year of the curriculum, how much more does it cost for those kids who are not being successful, and how much more in addition for those kids who are at isolated rural schools. The proposal is set out clearly. We do not do per-student funding in the way that the member is reaching for. It differs according to the schooling option, and we are getting different outcomes. And we're interested in, actually we're committed to, how do we get the best outcomes for every kid in our education system?
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Is sending one's children to an independent school a legitimate choice for a parent to make?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
It absolutely is a legitimate choice for parents to make, as it is to send them to partnership schools or to Māori medium schools, to single-sex schools and to co-ed schools.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
How does pumping millions of dollars more taxpayer funding into private schools increase choice for the vast majority of parents who cannot afford to pay thousands of dollars a term in tuition fees to send their kids to those schools?
That's right.
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Mr Speaker, the member seems to be labouring under the misapprehension that only certain parents send their children to independent schools. There are a range of parents, it is absolutely untrue. There are a range of parents who prioritise that as their choice and they make sacrifices to do that. These are New Zealand students in the same way as parents are choosing to send their kids to total immersion te reo Māori schools.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
If the government's stated goal is to direct extra resources to the students who are the most disadvantaged and most at need, how many of the students attending private schools fit into that category?
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Mr Speaker, that is one of our objectives, and that's why I explained that the funding model that's up for consultation is a base unit cost for the curriculum, and then on top of that, those kids who are disadvantaged, how do we pay more for that? I don't run the roles of private schools or indeed of mainstream schools, so I cannot give you those specific answers.
Order. Question number 7.